Today, we're going to be telling you how the media affects the public on a macro level. I'm Alexa Easley.
And I'm Skyler Boswell.
The media is the most effective way that public knowledge on global political and cultural topics is formed. Public knowledge is what the general public knows as a whole instead of what individuals know. The media is a very broad term. However, the key component of the media that shapes public knowledge is news, made up of journalists and the private news entities that they work for. People consume news in various different ways, whether it be through TV, through newspapers, the radio.
One of the newest ways that people can receive news is through the internet. The internet has facilitated what media scholars refer to as information overload. The idea that people are introduced to way more information than they can even process. It is true that the internet has helped people access information easily, but it has also burdened people with too much, inconsistent, or just plain incorrect news coverage. With a seemingly infinite amount of news and media, it is important to be able to weed out fake and unreliable media sources.
There are three primary models that explain communication flow in mass media. The first one is the two-step flow theory. In this theory, opinion leaders that are closely connected with mass media outlets receive the information. This is the first step. Next, those opinion leaders slightly modify the message they've received and then transmit them to people that are connected to them. The next is the knowledge gap theory, which suggests that media messages are absorbed more or less fully based on the media outlet that the message is coming from and the socioeconomic status of the person receiving the message. The discrepancy creates a knowledge gap about certain issues. In the last theory, diffusion of information, it's similar to the two-step theory, which assumes that knowledge trickles down to multiple levels, but instead of the two-step theory, this theory spreads many levels.
Next, we are going to talk about two theories in which the media influences the public knowledge. The first theory is agenda-setting theory. This theory describes the ability the media has to influence the salience of issues presented by news sources.
The next theory is cultivation theory, which shows a relationship between the amount of TV that someone watches and the extent to which they believe TV actually represents reality. For high TV viewers, this theory can also lead to them developing mean world syndrome, which we will discuss later in the video.
So I'm going to be discussing how the media affects the public's belief system through agenda-setting theory. Agenda-setting theory was originally created by McCombs and Shaw in 1972, and it describes the media's ability to influence what issues are deemed as important through what they choose to cover in their news media sources. The news outlet covers an issue a lot and deems it as important. The general public will also think that it's important. There are two different phases of agenda setting theory in the media. First order agenda setting includes the media or gatekeepers telling us what to think about. So it's them choosing what news stories that they're going to cover and presenting them to us. The second level of agenda setting theory goes one step further, and not only do gatekeepers tell us what to think about, they also are going to tell us how to think about it. And they go about this through a process called framing, which is where they choose what to include, what to emphasize, and what to leave out of a particular issue or news story so that they can present it in a certain way. So an individual's different level of being influenced by the media's agenda is done by their need for orientation. Their need for orientation depends on two different factors: relevancy and uncertainty. So the more relevant a news story is to a person, the more likely they are to tune into it. And the less information somebody has about a particular issue also makes them more likely to tune into it. So if a person is not really connected to a story or knows a lot already about the story, they're less likely to be influenced by agenda setting at all. So a media example that I have that puts agenda setting theory into action would be how American news outlets covered the outbreak of Ebola. It was very sensationalized, and most coverage made it sound like the Ebola outbreak was an imminent danger to everybody, when in reality there were only 2 cases in America of people infected with Ebola. So this media example shows how news outlets can take an issue that is not really relevant to the general public and make them think that it is.
Cultivation theory examines the long-term effects of watching TV. It suggests that the more time someone spends watching TV, the more they believe that social reality aligns with the TV reality that they watch. This theory was developed by George Gerbner and Larry Gross in 1976. The researchers believed that TV as a mass medium of communication binds diverse communities together and socializes people into standardized roles and behaviors. An example of cultivation theory is when somebody watches a lot of violent TV and then they begin to think that the world is a more violent place and people are more distrusting than they actually are. In cultivation theory, this is known as the mean world syndrome.
In 2011, Mulligan and Habel conducted an experiment to find out if agenda-setting theory could be used to explain the influence of political issues in fictional media and not just in news media. The experiment had half of its participants watch a movie that frames abortion in a pro-choice way. Then they had all participants fill out a questionnaire about their opinions on abortion, and the results showed that the people who watched the film opinions were consistent with the framing of the film.
Researchers Selepak and Kane conducted a study in 2015 on Law and Order viewers' perception of crime and racial criminality in New York City. The study not only compared the show's portrayal of race and crime to actual crime statistics in New York City, but it also examined viewers' perceived level of personal safety. Law and Order viewers were asked how likely they perceived someone would cause them physical bodily harm within the next year, how likely they were to be a victim of violence within the next year, and to estimate the degree of violent crimes committed by whites, blacks, and Hispanics. Results from this study reveal 3 interesting outcomes. White people are disproportionately portrayed as criminals 5 to 8 times more often on police dramas than actual crime statistics in New York City. Watching police dramas increased the perception of threat to personal safety, and watching police dramas led to increased perception of white criminality among non-whites. These findings overwhelmingly support the assumptions of cultivation theory and mean world syndrome.
Future research questions. Our first question is based off of the Mulligan and Habel study that looked at agenda-setting theory in a way to explain fictional television's impacts on our opinions. We are curious to find out if all fictional media types are just as capable of persuading us to form an opinion on a political issue as news media and even fictional television is, if that issue is framed a specific way. In other words, can agenda-setting theory be used to explain people's formation of political issues in media such as music and books just as easily as it can be in TV and news sources?
Another question we are curious about was the possibility of cultivation theory being applied to other forms of media rather than just television. While long-term exposure to television is a key component to cultivation theory as it currently stands, we were interested to know if research would show any results of similar effects with long-term exposure to other types of media. Could we cultivate our views of the outside world based on long-term exposure to the same online news sources or from exposure to lots of the same music with the same messages? Or does cultivation only take place when people are watching things being acted out on a screen? After watching this video, we hope you can see how the media affects public knowledge based on cultivation theory and agenda setting theory.
Since we are constantly being exposed to different kinds of media, it's important for us to understand the ways that it affects us.